Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continual improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISology Hub. The ISology Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISology Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ian Battersby, Senior Consultant with Blackmores UK Limited. Good to be with you again today for another ISO show. Today I'm going to talk about environmental emergency preparedness and response, particularly talking about emergency preparedness and response with respect to protection of the environment as opposed to any other type of emergency preparedness. There does seem to be some confusion in this area, and I'd like to try and address that and help people to focus on what's really important in conforming to ISO 14001, which is the Environmental Management System Standard. We're probably all very familiar with emergency situations which threaten life and, of course, threaten assets and goods. My intention here isn't to try and minimise those. It's extremely important that they're addressed, regardless of the requirements of any standard. But I want to be precise and explore what 14001 is asking us to do. If we were to apply ISO 45001 on occupational health and safety management, and indeed the law in the UK and elsewhere, we would have to ensure that there are plans in place to reasonably foresee and prevent any serious harm to a person or persons affected by our activities. This is, of course, of prime importance to everybody. But 14001 isn't asking us to address harm to persons. We have to plan to prevent harm to the environment. Let's be clear, the two are not mutually exclusive, and some emergency planning can cover both environmental and human harm. But we must guard against rolling out the fire evacuation plan and fire drills as our first pieces of evidence when demonstrating that we conform to 14001. Well, a fire is, of course, a very bad outcome for the environment. Once it's occurred, the evacuation of people from a burning building offers little in the way of an environmental response. So note that word as well. The standard in clause 8.2 requires two things: emergency preparedness and response. So while preparing to prevent the fire is a perfectly valid thing to do under the standard 14001, protecting the lives of the people does not necessarily contribute to the environmental response. So preparing and response are two different things. Anyway, less about fire and more about standards. This clause, 8.2, starts with the words, the organisation shall establish, implement and maintain the processes needed to prepare for and respond to potential emergency situations. As always, I love the standards giving us a handy reference to other parts of themselves. And in this case, this standard tells us where we should be identifying the emergency situations it's talking about. They're identified in clause 6.1.1. Now, clause 6.1 is our old friend. This is about risk. So actions to address risk and opportunities. So in the general requirement to this 6.1.1, we must determine the risks and opportunities related to environmental aspects, which are precise definition, and compliance obligations, and other issues and requirements. And those issues and requirements are born out of the context setting that's required under all the management system standards. Everything needs to be relevant to your specific context. So your aspects, your obligations, your risks are very specific to you and your circumstance. Then the standard goes on to say, within the scope of the environmental management system, the organisation shall determine potential emergency situations, including those that can have an environmental impact. So you see, it's very explicitly about environmental impact, not human impact. I've just mentioned that we should determine risks associated with environmental aspects, and the clause 6.1.2 on environmental aspects says the organisation shall determine the environmental aspects of its activities, products and services that it controls and those that it can influence and their associated environmental impacts. When determining these, the organisation shall take into account abnormal conditions and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. So, this is where we should already have established the emergency situations for which we need to plan. Risk management is a core of the standards, and planning for emergency situations is a core of risk management. But we don't write plans in isolation like this. We already have established what is important that requires planning. So the remainder of clause 6.1 goes on to talk about planning action, and it says the organisation should plan to take action to address its risks, but also plan how to integrate its management system and its other business processes, and also evaluate the effectiveness of the actions. So this is all again part of the plan, do, check, act cycle, PDCA, which we're so fond of. And also demonstrates how interconnected the clauses are, something we talk about quite often. Let's have a look at the implications of this. As an auditor, I don't start with the emergency plan or plans when we talk about emergency preparedness and response. As I've explained, the standard says that we should have established the environmental impact of what we do, including in emergency situations. So I go straight to an organisation's aspects and impact assessment, as required, as I mentioned, in clause 6. The structure of an aspects and impact assessment is really very important. The standard isn't prescriptive on how you assess the impact of what you do or the risks. The methodology for that is your choice. But it is very explicit in that the content must include abnormal conditions and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. You can't foresee what you can't foresee, so it does talk about reasonably foreseeable. I won't dwell on how to do an aspects and impacts assessment in any great detail here. It will be the subject of another ISO show, but we should be clear to make some distinctions about what the terminology means. So normal situations, as I've just touched on, they are when everything operates as you intend. It's business as usual, the day-to-day activities you expect. For example, the standard operation of machinery, a vehicle getting from A to B without any issues, any cause for alarm. Abnormal situations are when things aren't quite right. Not catastrophic, but not business as usual. You can still achieve your intended outcome, but you maybe don't do it as quickly or as efficiently as you ought to. Examples of that include where machinery is running inefficiently or perhaps uses more fuel or something like lubricant than usual. These circumstances don't necessarily require an emergency plan, but you may want to monitor the severity of such situations and their potential for significant impact if they're not addressed. Now, emergency situations, which is what we're talking about really here, are serious events requiring immediate attention and which could cause significant environmental impacts. So, what sorts of emergency situations may occur? Well, it all depends on the type of organisation, obviously. But common examples include fire, we've touched on, chemical, and fuel spill. I'll come back to examples in a moment, but I just want to return to the standard and the clause on the emergency preparedness itself. Well, emergency preparedness and response in 8.2. We're required there to plan to respond to or mitigate adverse environmental impacts from emergency. Again, not human environmental. But then we're required to respond to actual emergencies. We are required to mitigate the consequences of those emergencies. We're required to periodically test the planned response and to review and revise the process, in particular after the occurrence of any emergency or any test. And then also we're required to provide relevant information and training to relevant interested parties, including persons working under our control. That's important. Not just direct employees. We need to make sure that everybody working under the auspices of the company's operation are actually taught about emergency situations. So that group of things there, planning, responding, testing, reviewing, again follows that plan, do, check, act approach. And also teaching people about your approach. So let's go back and look at examples of emergency situations. I've just mentioned fire is quite an important situation that we need to address. Although there are tried and tested methods for preventing fire, a quick web search showed me that there are still 22,000 workplace fires in the UK each year. And that, regardless of the human or asset cost, that's a significant environmental impact. Apparently, it's approximately 2,700 tonnes of carbon emissions annually. Plus, you've got the environmental toxins, ground and water contamination, resource loss, waste, and so on and so on, and all the other things which are the consequences, the environmental consequences of a fire. So in considering fire as an environmental emergency, these are the impacts. Our learned friends at IOSH also tell us that the most common cause of workplace fire is faulty or misused electrical equipment. And this is followed by causes such as the use of flammable and combustible material, dirt and clutter, human error, smoking and cooking. What's interesting about these causes is that they are generally required to be controlled by specific pieces of legislation and regulation. Remember earlier I talked about clause 6.1, risk, and said we must determine the risks and opportunities related to environmental aspects and compliance obligations, i.e. legal and regulatory obligations. So with my auditor's hat back on, I'd be looking for a link between the compliance obligations or legal register, the aspects and impacts assessment, and the controls which are in place to minimise the risks arising out of both of those. Now, faulty electrics stands out there as the most common cause of fire. So I'd then be looking at the measures to prevent such faults occurring. Preventive maintenance of equipment, inspection and testing of electrical fixed wiring, portable appliance testing. By demonstrating the process in place to address these, we can evidence compliance obligations and the planning to reduce the possibility of an emergency situation arising. So that is planning for emergency situations. But the situation may still arise. When we look at planning to prevent such a situation escalating into a full-blown emergency, we need to look at how to prevent the environmental impact from that emergency, okay? Not the human under 14,001. So the maintenance, inspection and testing of fire detection or suppression systems, the inspection and servicing of firefighting equipment. And if we're relying on firefighting equipment as part of the response, I'd be looking for evidence that suitable people have been trained in its use. There's no point having a fire extinguisher and nobody knowing what to do with it. That doesn't help the people or the environment. And based on what I know about the causes of fire, from my short research with IOSH there, I would examine smoking policies and practices, catering equipment maintenance, housekeeping, hazardous material management, and so on. So these all form part of your prevention planning. If I want to look at evidence that fire drills take place and are effective, I may struggle to see anything which demonstrates that the drill is useful in minimising the impact on the environment. Remember that if you're in a 14,001 audit and the auditor asks copies of recent fire drills, I've been prompted to ask, how does that help the environment? How does that fit in 14,001? An area where we can more readily see that preparedness and response directly affects the environmental outcome is where there's been a spillage of some kind. But again, be mindful that the emergency plan under 14,001 should address the environmental impact. A spill of a lubricant on a shop floor, for instance, has the potential to cause a slip hazard affecting the safety of people. The preventive measures, again, have similarities, regardless of whether we're talking about safety or environment. But they do differ in that they're trying to prevent the lubricant then reaching the outside world and contaminating. That's the environmental impact. So is the waste disposal associated with the mopping of a spill, for instance. The sausages and the mats themselves become hazardous waste and must be disposed of in a controlled fashion under the law. Again, a compliance obligation, so something attached to the environmental impact. And again, I would examine both the compliance obligation register and the environmental aspects and impacts assessment to see that these are linked in some way to the emergency planning. I could go on, but I won't list every type of emergency for which we may need to plan. It's a very long list, and your organisation will experience different types of emergencies to others. What I want to do, though, is end on a reminder. In ISO 14001, it's about planning for and responding to emergency situations which have an adverse impact on the environment, not necessarily on the people. Your management system and your evidence in an audit should directly address that, not the human safety issues. Thank you for listening. I hope that clarifies what emergency planning is all about from a 14,001 perspective. There's an awful lot more detail that sits under that, which we may address in the future. But that's where I'll leave it for today. Before I go, I'd just like to remind everybody to subscribe on your preferred media player if you've not already done so. And if you've got a spare 5 minutes, please leave us a nice review. And 5 stars if possible. This really helps us to reach a wider audience, having the reviews. As always, if you have any questions about this topic, any suggestions for future topics, please feel free to send us an email or just comment in the media player that you use. We'd love to hear from you on whatever topic is of interest to you. That's all from me today, so thank you for listening, and we'll catch up with you on the next ISO show. Goodbye.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.